So we're going to be doing the tubular cast on, which actually starts by using waste yarn to do a provisional cast on. So I'm going to use a crochet hook because that's my favorite way of doing a provisional cast on. My waste yarn will be this bright blue, and I'm going to cast it onto my bigger needle. Start off by doing a slip knot, putting that on your crochet hook. Then get your needle. Make sure the yarn is coming underneath the needle like this. And then you'll take your hook, grab the yarn over top, and then pull it through that loop. Then before you do the next one, you want to move your yarn in between the needle and the crochet hook back to the back before you do it again. So, to the back, and then pull it through. So that's 3 stitches so far. You don't want to do this too tightly. You continue this process until you have as many stitches on your needle as the directions say. And if you have too many, like I do, you can just pop them right off. And I'm going to use this last little one here to do a little chain so that I know this is the side I will pull off later. So you just have your loop there, just pull through, like you're doing a crochet chain. Just do a few so that you know this is the side you pull out. Alright, so our next set of directions, we are going to move away from our waste yarn and go onto our main colored yarn. And we're going to do stockinette stitch for 4 rows. So I'm going to start by knitting all of these stitches. Keep in mind this part might go a little slow because they're not very elastic stitches from doing that cast on. So it just may take another extra minute or two. We now have 4 rows of stockinette, and we just finished doing a purl row, so our next row will be a knit row. We are going to now undo the provisional cast on here in the bright blue, and we're going to put those stitches onto a smaller needle than what we had originally working here, so that it'll be a little bit easier to do this next step. If you decided to do this little chain at the end, you'll easily know that this is the side that you'll want to undo and should pop off nicely across your stitches so that you can not waste too much time doing this step. So what you'll want to do is just undo the little knot here. This is where you pull the yarn through when you finished, and then you'll just be able to pull it right out. That's your first stitch right there. If you turn it around, it becomes really obvious where the stitches are that you need to pick up. So if doing this part makes you nervous, pulling one out at a time like you're going to lose some stitches, you can actually thread the yarn through these bumps before you pull out the provisional cast on. So we want to just keep doing that. or you can just pull the stitches out as you go. Whatever's faster or easier for you. So now what you have is 2 circular needles full of live stitches, and our next step is going to be folding these in half and basically knitting a stitch from the front and the back to simultaneously seam this little hem edge here and set up our 1x1 ribbing. You want to make sure that the side with your larger needle, where your working yarn is attached, is in the front towards you, and that the smaller needle is set up in the back. It's a little easier if you scoot up all these stitches. There we go. And if you can sort of sandwich them, that's even better. At this point, you'll just be knitting off of the back needle, or the smaller needle. You will no longer be using the front needle. It was just sort of a stitch holder at this point, and will no longer be used. Since we're setting up a 1x1 rib, we're going to knit a stitch from the front. Then we are actually going to purl a stitch from the back. And you're going to keep doing that. Knit the stitch in the front, purl the stitch in the back, knit a stitch in the front. And if you see, like, my stitches here are twisted, so the back leg is pointing out where the front leg usually points out, you can knit it from the back loop. Instead, it'll actually be a lot easier and more comfortable to do that, and it will reorient your stitch so that you don't have to worry about that at a later time. So, knit from the front. And then this stitch is actually on there correctly, so you're just going to purl from the back. And continue knitting one from the front, followed by one from the back, until you reach the end of your row. What you can see happening here is that you have a really nice patterned edge that's really very stretchy and is the perfect hem for a sleeve or a hat or any number of options that you like to have a nice finished edge. The last stitch here is a little tricky. If your needle falls out, just pop it back in. And then I'm going to use this last stitch here around that needle. knit. See, that is a purl bump, and then that is a knitted V. So if there's a bump over by the stitch, that means that was a stitch that had been purled. So knit, purl, knit. If you had stopped here, your next one would be a purl. Easy. At this point, you can choose to either continue working in a flat piece or join it in the round to continue working on something like a hat or the hem of a sweater. Enjoy!
I'm going to show you some examples of helical knitting and just the different combinations that you can make with this pattern. So basically you're going to have 4 working strands at the same time once you get up to do the helical knitting. And here we have 3 rows of turquoise and 1 of a green. Here we have 2 rows of red, 1 of an orange, 1 of a green. Here we have a 2x2, it's 2 blue, 2 green. And here, again, it's 4 rows, but it's like a black, a medium gray, black, light gray. So depending on how you put your yarn, or pick up your yarns as you're going around the first time, is the pattern that you're going to get. Okay, let me go on and show you now how, for the 4 examples that we have here, how you go about getting these different striping sequences. This is 3 rows of turquoise, 1 of green. To do that, this is to represent our knitting in the round. These are our stitch markers. What you would do is, when you start the helical knitting, you would do 3 sections of the turquoise, and then you would do 1 of green. Then you would do 3 of turquoise, 1 green. Again, 3 turquoise. You just keep doing this around and around, and it will look like this. For 2x2, what you would do, again, beginning of the round, if you would start pink, pink, green, green, pink, pink, green, green. So basically we are having 3 sections, but we have 4 working yarns, so it's constantly spiraling around. That's how you do the 2x2. In this hat, we have 2 rows of red, 1 of orange, 1 of green. So you would just 1 section, 2nd section red, 3rd section orange, 4th section green. So that is your pattern. So you would just go red, red, orange, green, red, red, orange, green, just like that. And then for this hat, we are going to start with a dark gray, go to a light gray, go to a dark gray, go to a middle gray. Okay, here we have, we're going to call this darkest gray, this light gray. Again, we go back to the dark gray, and then here we have the middle gray. And then you would just repeat that again. So, the darkest, the lightest, the darkest, the middle gray. And again, you just keep going in that fashion, and it's just going to spiral all the way up the hat. Now I'm going to show you how to start the helical knitting process. What we have here is, I have done the tubular cast on. I have done the 1x1 ribbing. I have just gotten to the point where I changed my needle size. I did the decrease, and now for this size I have 66 stitches on the needles. I have gone through, I have put 3 stitch markers in, and there are 22 stitches between each of the stitch markers. So now it's time to start the helical knitting. And how do we do that? Okay, what I want to do on this hat is the 2x2. So I'm going to have 2 stripes of one color, 2 stripes of the other color. And one of my striping sections is going to be the same color as the ribbed cuff. So what I'm going to do is start knitting with my working yarn that is attached that I've done all the other work. If you wanted to use a different color than your cuff, then this would be the time that you would start the new color. But I'm going to have 2 rows be this color and then 2 rows be in this light turquoise color. So here we go. What you do, we're just going to start at the round. So we're going to start just knitting, and we are going to knit until we get to the next marker. You might think, wow, that's a lot of extra work just to work with 4 balls. Why would you do that? Well, helical knitting does provide some advantages, and one of them is that because you're really not knitting rounds per se, you won't get that jog. You are knitting basically a spiral that just spirals as it goes up, so you never really have that jog. So it takes care of the jog and makes the transition seamless, because there is no transition. So here we are knitting to the marker, and then once I get to the marker, I'm going to add a ball. And because I want the 2 stripes to be the same color, I'm going to use this same color. So I'm going to pick up a new ball of yarn, same color, going to add it in, and then I'm just going to continue to knit until I get to the next marker. When I get to the next stitch marker, I am going to pick up another ball of yarn, and this time it is going to be this light robin's egg blue. All right, I slip the marker. I put the needle in as if to knit. I'm going to grab the end, and we're just going to start knitting with it. So now I just make sure I knit with the working yarn and not the tail. And I just knit every stitch. You'll probably notice that, you know, the first stitch when you add that new color or that ball, that stitch is going to be loose until you weave those ends in. So don't let that bother you. You can always adjust at the end. When you weave in your ends, you can even out the tension and make those holes disappear. So again, we had the working yarn. We knit one section with that. We then knit the second section with the same color but a different ball. Then this is our third section. It was the first one with the light turquoise color. And then, but we're back at the beginning of the round. So the way this works, we're now going to slip our marker, and there is no yarn there because our working yarn ended up at the first stitch marker, so this is where we add our 4th working yarn. So I'm just going to knit with this working yarn again until I get to the next stitch marker. And I got my yarn snuggled up. We want to use this one. Yarn management is key, and the more you do it, the better the easier it gets, so don't let that bother you. Okay, so we are knitting to the next stitch marker. And once we get there, I will show you what the back looks like so you can understand what all the strands are. Okay, so we've come to the next stitch marker. And it's a little loose. It's fine because we can tighten that up when we are weaving in our ends. Or in this case, this is the working yarn that we're going to pick up next. So I want to slip the marker. I want to put my needle in this stitch as if I'm going to knit. I want to look at the strands now on the back. So we have the working yarn that just brought us up to the stitch marker. We have the working yarn that was left from the row below, and then we have the tail So what I need to do now is knit with the working yarn from the row below. So I'm going to just kind of snug that tail up because that is really crazy loose. And then I'm going to grab my working yarn from the row below. And this is where you have to be careful not to pull too tightly. Because here, this is what happens if you pull too tightly. It's going to pucker the fabric because this mother stitch, or whatever this stitch is down here, it's not on a needle, and so it needs to be the size of this needle even though it's not. So you just want to make sure that that is not too tight. So I'm actually going to open that up a little bit because I did pull it tight. Pull it tightly. Okay, and that's much better. So now I'm going to go on and knit. I'm just going to leave this last working yarn behind, and I'm just going to start knitting with the next one. And again, this big loop, you can pull your end and just kind of snug it, but you don't want it to be too tight. Again, it's better to be loose than too tight. You can always redistribute some extra, yarn in between some stitches, but it's hard to make yarn when your fabric is puckered and there's really no fixing that. So you just knit again up until you get to the next marker, and then you're going to leave this strand of working yarn behind, and you are going to pick up the next working yarn and knit to the next marker. It really is just that easy. I will give you some words of wisdom based on me thinking that I knew best. I'm going to pick up my next working yarn, which is this one from the row below. Not pulling too tightly. But one thing you don't want to do is wrap your yarn. I thought, well, if I just tacked it down or, twisted my yarns, I thought if I twisted my yarns, that would just help. No, don't wrap your yarns, don't twist your yarns. It does not help, it just makes your fabric pucker. So you might say, well, hey, I thought you were doing a two rounds of one color, 2 rounds of the other color. You are, well, first of all, good eye if you did see that. Second of all, it's only in this first couple rows that you will get a stripe that is a single stripe. But here shortly, they are going to start coming out 2 rows of the same color. Okay, we're back to the beginning of the round. I'm going to slip my marker. I'm going to leave this working yarn here. I'm just going to let it hang. I'm not going to pull tightly. I'm just going to look at the back. I'm going to see that this is my tail. This is my next working yarn that I want to work with, so I am not going to pull it tight. I am just going to knit the stitch. Better too loose than too tight. And then I'm just going to knit to the next marker. Okay, get to the stitch marker, slip the stitch marker, and I can tell that hopefully my working yarn here that I'm going to grab is going to be the gray color because I need a second row of that. So I'm going to let go of this working yarn that brought me here. Then I'm going to look for the next one. And I'm just going to gently pull on this yarn until the stitch is about the same size as the one next to it. Don't pull it firm or you'll be sorry. You will get a pucker. And then I'm just going to knit to the next stitch marker with this working yarn. Alright, once again, we've come to the end of the round, even though we really don't have rounds anymore because we are knitting helically. But I'm going to slip the marker. I'm going to leave this yarn behind. I am going to grab this yarn and start knitting, not pulling too tightly. So you just continue in this manner, and I will do a few rows of knitting so you can actually see what it looks like once it's a little bit off the needles. And I'll be back to show you that in just a couple minutes. So, after you've knit several rounds, this is what it's going to look like. If you see a little hole, it's where, ooh, I just showed you my bad yarn management. If you see a little hole, it's usually, or it should be, where you had a tail on the inside. You'll be able to totally weave that in, and that hole will disappear. So really, you just continue knitting in the round, picking up that each new yarn at the marker, and you just knit, knit, knit until your hat is as long as the directions say, or as long as you want it to be. And for these, we do give you the option of either knitting, you know, a standard size hat, or you can knit it longer and make it slouchy. Just a couple extra inches goes from standard to slouchy. If you have yarn left over, you want to make a pom-pom, that's always an option also. Makes it fun and sporty. So make it your own, have fun, and keep knitting.
The pattern shows two illustrations. One of them is with the hat crown visual like this. So beginning with the beginning of round marker, you have section 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then on the other half 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. But in this circle we have section 1 through 6 and section 7 through 12. Now, just so that I can show you how this is going to flip, I'm going to tie a bit of a slip knot right here in this first section 1 through 6 scrap yarn, because at this point you need to turn your hat inside out. And when you turn your hat inside out and put it down so that the beginning of the round is in front of you, you will see that your scrap yarn for section 1 through 12 is now on the right. I just put that in a slip knot. So now, and the schematic in the pattern shows you section 1 through 6 is going to be on the right hand side now. So that's going to be important when you're picking these up. So what we're going to do, and this is why you have your stitches on separate pieces of scrap yarn. We're going to take section 1 here and section 6 way over here, and we're going to put them on one double point needle. So for the purposes of that, I'm using the pointed end, and now I am picking these up. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Before I take it off the scrap yarn, I'm going to go ahead and put the other end section on here as well. And basically what you're being asked to do is put those on the same needle like this. Okay? So after the marker, we're going to pick up the last 9 stitches. Now, the reason you're using 2 pieces of scrap yarn on either, or one on either half, is so that you can take out each end like this. So I'm going to pull this off of these stitches and this end off of these stitches. Whoops, my slip knot's in the way. There we go. Now we've got 2 stitch markers that we can take off, and we still have the rest of our stitches on hold on this scrap yarn. We need to put the sections 7 and 12 on the other double pointed needle. So we're going to do the exact same thing, only on the opposite side of the hat. So now this is section 12 and this is section 7. So we're going to put 1, 2, 3. Okay, here comes the fun part. We're going to snug these up together, and we are now going to do a 3 needle bind off. And for those of you who don't know how to do a 3 needle bind off, here you go. We're going to take the working yarn that was left from this section, which is very convenient, and we are going to knit the first stitch, or rather put our needle into the first stitch on this needle, into the first stitch on the second needle, knit them and take that through both and take it off. That's our first stitch. Then we do the next stitch on each needle, and a 3 needle join would be if you just carried on, but we're actually binding these off at the same time. So now we're going to take that first stitch that we made and slide it up and over the second stitch. That's 1 stitch bound off, and we are just going to carry on straight across, off, and then over. That's our second needle. And you do want to be careful that you're not, you have to work at the tips of the needles, but you want to be careful not to take off more than just the 1 set at a time, or you'll be dropping stitches and having problems. So you can see this bind off beginning right here. So you're taking it through that, both stitches at the same time, and off both needles at the same time, and then binding it off. And there's another. So you're going to have 9 stitches first knit together and then bound off on each side of those needles. When you get to the middle section, you want to make sure that you keep everything nice and tight into the center. So we're going to bind off the first of that second section and up and over. like that. Let me do that again. Into the first stitch, into the second stitch. There we go. And then up and over. And what's happening is you are combining this section to this section across the middle of the hat. You pull this up, pull your yarn through, and you have the first of your 3 connections. I will go ahead and do the rest, and you do it in the same way. Okay, when it's time to pick up the next section, we're going to pick up section 2, which I've already done here, and it is going to be puckered together with section 3, like this. But this is going to be on a separate needle, section 3. So I pick up section 2 right across from section 9. And it's getting tight in here, so I'm not sure you can, I'll stop moving in a minute. This was our section 1 and 7, 3 needle binded off with section 7 and 12. So if this was 7, that meant the next section here is 8, and the next section is 9. So we are going to join section 2 to section 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Now, we're not able to take the stitch marker or the scrap yarn out because we still have section 8 to load onto a needle. So, what we need to do is take another needle, and again, I'm going to load section 3. I've already removed the scrap section, or the scrap yarn from section 2. So I have it here at section 3. 1. So now we have section 2 and 3 basically closing like this, right there. And then on the other end of this needle, I'm going to load section 8, which is way over here. And I will start from the scrap yarn side where it's exiting, and I will pick them up. It's a little more difficult here. So now you can see I've closed another section here on both sides, and we're going to bind those off with a 3 needle bind off again. Now I'm going to pull this section of scrap yarn out of section 8, remove the stitch marker, pull it out of section 9, and remove the stitch marker, and pull it out of section 3. And remove the stitch marker. So what we have, just as a quick brief, this was section 1 in our first, this is section 2, section 3, and across the way is section 8 and section 9. So we combine section 2 and 9, and we're going to snug them up tight, and 3 and 8 and snug them up tight. And take them off. And there's our second section. So here's our first section, 1 and 6, 7 and 12. Here's 2 and 9, 3 and 8. And our last is going to be these two sections, which will be 10 and 11 and 4 and 5. Okay, so you can probably see how you're going to load your needle. Starting at the marker, we load from the marker, and I'm doing it the far side first. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Whoops, kind of lost our stitches here. There's 8. Come on, 8. 8 and 9. And here we are at our last stitch, 4 stitches to knit off the needle, and a bind off, and pull that very small tail through, and that's all we'll need to sew in. Here are your sections knit together, or bound off together in sections, obviously. And then here is the outside of your hat. And it makes rather a nice, nice finish.